When we speak about ancient philosophy, the images that usually come to mind are overwhelmingly male. Marble statues of bearded thinkers, names repeated endlessly in classrooms and documentaries, voices preserved through centuries of copying and institutional memory. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. This familiar canon creates the illusion that philosophy was born, developed, and transmitted almost exclusively by men. This illusion is false. From the earliest periods of philosophical thought, women were present. They thought, taught, debated, calculated, observed the natural world, and reflected deeply on ethics, the soul, and the structure of reality. Their absence from mainstream philosophical history is not the result of intellectual weakness, but of historical selection. What survived was what institutions chose to preserve. Ancient philosophy was not limited to books. It was lived, spoken, memorized, sung, and practiced in daily life. Ideas circulated through dialogue, mentorship, religious ritual, mathematics, and ethical conduct. This matters greatly when discussing women philosophers, because many of them operated outside the formal structures that guaranteed textual survival. Their philosophy often existed in practice rather than in treatises copied by later scholars. One of the earliest philosophical traditions in which women clearly participated was the Pythagorean movement. This community did not separate mathematics, ethics, cosmology, and lifestyle. To understand reality meant to live in harmony with it. Within this framework, women were not excluded from philosophical training. On the contrary, several women were recognized as thinkers in their own right. Theano of Croton is one of the most frequently mentioned figures in this tradition. Ancient accounts associate her with mathematical and ethical writings, particularly on harmony, proportion, and moderation. These concepts were not abstract ideals. They structured the Pythagorean understanding of the universe and the human soul. To live well was to maintain balance, to avoid excess, and to align one's actions with rational order. Theano's philosophical contribution is especially significant because it directly contradicts ancient stereotypes about women. In a culture that often portrayed women as irrational or ruled by emotion, she emphasized self-control, discipline, and reason as ethical virtues applicable to everyone. Her thought integrates intellectual rigor with practical life, demonstrating that philosophy does not belong only to public debate or political power. Another Pythagorean thinker, Mia of Croton, focused on ethics within the household. Rather than dismissing domestic life as philosophically irrelevant, she treated it as a primary site of moral formation. According to this view, how children are raised, how food is prepared, how resources are managed, and how relationships are maintained are all matters of ethical reasoning. This approach quietly undermines one of the deepest assumptions of ancient philosophy, that the public sphere is the true home of thought. Maya's work suggests that justice, moderation, and rational order begin long before one speaks in an assembly or writes a law. They begin in daily choices, habits, and care. Philosophy becomes intimate, embodied, and continuous. In classical Athens, another woman challenged the boundaries of philosophy in a different way. Aspasia of Miletus lived at the center of Athenian intellectual life during the 5th century BCE. Although barred from formal political participation, she became renowned for her rhetorical skill and intellectual influence. Ancient writers describe her as a teacher of rhetoric and a participant in philosophical conversations with leading thinkers of her time. Aspasia's presence disturbed traditional expectations. A woman speaking publicly, instructing men, and shaping political discourse was deeply unsettling in a society that associated authority with male citizenship. Her example reveals that philosophy is not only about ideas, but about who is allowed to speak and be heard. These early figures force us to reconsider what philosophy looked like in antiquity. It was not a closed male lineage, it was a contested space, shaped by exclusion as much as by brilliance. Women philosophers existed not on the margins of thought, but within its living core, even when history later pushed them into silence. This silence is not empty. It is filled with traces, fragments, testimonies, and echoes that still challenge us to listen more carefully. As philosophical thought moved beyond the classical period and into the Hellenistic world, its geography expanded and its tone shifted. Philosophy was no longer centered only in city-states like Athens. It spread across Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria, and beyond, following the paths of empire, trade, and cultural exchange. With this expansion came new schools of thought and, crucially, new spaces in which women could participate more visibly as philosophers. The Hellenistic age transformed philosophy into something more personal. Earlier traditions had focused heavily on politics, ideal states, and public virtue. Hellenistic philosophy turned inward. It asked how to live well in an unstable world, how to face suffering, how to discipline desire, and how to achieve inner freedom. This shift created openings for women because philosophy became less tied to formal citizenship and more connected to individual practice. One of the most important developments of this period was the rise of philosophical schools as communities of life rather than purely intellectual institutions. Epicureans, Stoics, Cynics, and later Platonists treated philosophy as a way of being. Membership depended not on gender or political status, but on commitment to a shared ethical vision. Within these communities, women studied alongside men, debated ideas, and embodied philosophical ideals in daily conduct. Epicurean philosophy, often misunderstood as simple pleasure-seeking, actually emphasized moderation, friendship, and freedom from fear. Women played an active role in Epicurean communities, where intellectual equality was more explicitly acknowledged than in many other schools. Epicurean texts suggest that women were not merely students, but contributors to philosophical discussions about desire, happiness, and the nature of the soul. Stoicism, with its focus on rational self-control and acceptance of fate, also attracted women philosophers. Stoic ethics argued that virtue depends on reason, not on gender, wealth, or social status. If reason is universal, then so is the capacity for wisdom. This idea quietly undermined entrenched hierarchies, even if social realities often lagged behind philosophical principles. Some women associated with Stoic thought lived lives that directly challenged traditional expectations. They practiced ascetic discipline, rejected luxury, and embraced intellectual rigor. For these women, philosophy was not an ornament or hobby. It was a radical form of self-fashioning. To live according to reason was to refuse the roles imposed by custom when those roles conflicted with ethical truth. Cynic philosophy pushed this rejection even further. Cynics believed that social conventions corrupted human nature. They advocated simplicity, shamelessness, and absolute freedom. Women who adopted Cynic principles shocked ancient observers by living publicly, speaking openly, and rejecting marriage norms, modest dress, and domestic confinement. Their very existence functioned as philosophical argument. These women did not write systematic treatises. Their philosophy was enacted through the body, walking barefoot, wearing rough cloaks, sleeping outdoors, and speaking boldly to men in power. They transformed daily life into a critique of social hypocrisy. In doing so, they exposed how deeply philosophy had been tied to privilege and respectability. At the same time, Platonism continued to evolve. Plato himself had argued that women could be guardians in the ideal state, capable of the same intellectual training as men. Later Platonists expanded on this idea, emphasizing the soul rather than the body as the true seat of identity. If the soul is genderless, then intellectual excellence cannot be restricted by sex. This metaphysical move had significant consequences. It allowed women philosophers to be understood as minds first, bodies second. In theory, this opened the door to philosophical authority. In practice, acceptance remained fragile and dependent on patronage, reputation, and circumstance. Still, the idea persisted and it mattered. Nowhere is this more evident than in the intellectual culture of Alexandria. This city became a crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Eastern traditions. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy intertwined. Education was not confined to one language or one tradition. In this environment, women found opportunities to engage deeply with scientific and philosophical inquiry. Women philosophers of this period were often mathematicians, astronomers, and commentators. Their work challenged the artificial separation between science and philosophy. To understand the movement of the stars was also to reflect on order, necessity, and the structure of reason itself. Knowledge was unified, and women participated fully in that unity. However, visibility came at a cost. Women who taught publicly or gained influence attracted hostility. Ancient sources often responded to them with suspicion, sexualization, or moral panic. Intellectual authority in a female body provoked anxiety. As a result, women philosophers were frequently remembered through distorted narratives that emphasized scandal over substance. Yet even these hostile accounts testify to their impact. One does not invent controversy around a figure who is insignificant. The very effort to undermine women philosophers reveals how seriously they were taken by their contemporaries. By the late antique period, philosophy became increasingly intertwined with religion. Neoplatonism blurred the boundaries between metaphysics, theology, and spiritual practice. Philosophy aimed not only at understanding the world, but at transcending it. The goal was the purification of the soul and its return to a higher reality. Women played a crucial role in this transformation. They served as teachers, students, patrons, and exemplars of philosophical life. Some led schools, others mentored male philosophers who later gained greater fame. Their intellectual labor shaped the final forms of ancient philosophy before its transmission into medieval traditions. What unites all these women is not a single doctrine, but a shared resistance to silence. They thought in worlds that discouraged them from thinking. They spoke in cultures that questioned their right to speak, and they lived philosophically in ways that made forgetting them both possible and necessary for later narratives that preferred simplicity over truth. Ancient philosophy was never only the story of great men and preserved texts. It was also the story of fragile communities, embodied practices, and voices that survived in fragments. To recover women philosophers is not to add a footnote to history. It is to change the shape of the story itself. As ancient philosophy moved into its later phases, the figure of the woman philosopher became both more visible and more vulnerable. This was a paradoxical moment. On the one hand, philosophical schools increasingly accepted the idea that reason and the soul were not bound by gender. On the other hand, social, religious, and political tensions intensified, making intellectual authority more dangerous for those who stood outside accepted norms. By late antiquity, philosophy was no longer only a matter of ethics or logic. It had become a comprehensive worldview that claimed to explain the origin of reality, the structure of the cosmos, and the destiny of the soul. Philosophers were expected not merely to argue, but to embody truth. Their lives were scrutinized as much as their ideas. For women, this scrutiny was often harsher. Education in this period required exceptional access. Libraries, teachers, manuscripts, and leisure time were not evenly distributed. Women who entered philosophical life usually did so through specific channels: elite families, intellectual patronage, or religious communities that valued learning. Their presence was never accidental. It was the result of persistence, privilege, and personal resolve. Late antique philosophy emphasized assent. To philosophize was to rise above the material world, to detach from passions, and to purify the intellect. This language of transcendence could empower women by shifting value away from the physical body. At the same time, it could also erase them, treating individuality as an obstacle rather than a source of insight. Women philosophers often navigated this tension by adopting lives of visible restraint. Simplicity of dress, controlled speech, and disciplined behavior functioned as philosophical credentials. Authority was performed through austerity. The body became a site of argument, demonstrating mastery rather than inviting judgment. Teaching remained central. Philosophy was transmitted through commentary, dialogue, and close mentorship. Women taught privately and publicly, instructing students in logic, mathematics, metaphysics, and ethics. Some became known not only for their learning, but for their clarity of explanation and moral authority. Their classrooms were spaces of transformation, where philosophy shaped both thought and character. Yet intellectual success provoked resistance. Ancient narratives often responded to women philosophers by reframing them through emotion, scandal, or danger. When they could not be ignored, they were reinterpreted. Wisdom was turned into eccentricity, authority into seduction, influence into threat. These distortions were not incidental. They were strategies of containment. The blending of philosophy and religion intensified these dynamics. As monotheistic traditions gained power, philosophical practices associated with older systems were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Women philosophers, especially those connected to pagan traditions, found themselves at the intersection of intellectual rivalry and religious conflict. Their visibility made them symbols in struggles far larger than themselves. Despite these pressures, women continued to shape philosophical discourse. They wrote commentaries that clarified complex systems. They preserved texts by teaching them. They influenced students who would later become canonical figures. Their intellectual labor often survives indirectly, embedded in works attributed to men. Philosophy at this stage was no longer optimistic. It grappled with decline, loss, and fragmentation. Empires were unstable, institutions collapsed. Certainty was fragile. In this context, women philosophers offered continuity. Their commitment to teaching and ethical discipline sustained traditions through uncertainty. The figure of the woman philosopher in late antiquity challenges modern assumptions about progress. Increased abstraction did not automatically produce greater inclusion. Intellectual sophistication could coexist with social exclusion. Recognition remained conditional and reversible. What emerges from this period is not a story of linear improvement, but of endurance. Women philosophers adapted without surrendering. They spoke carefully but did not fall silent. They accepted constraints without internalizing inferiority. Their philosophy was not merely theoretical, it was strategic. To understand ancient women philosophers at this stage is to confront philosophy as a fragile human practice. Ideas do not survive on their own. They require communities, teachers, bodies, and voices. When those voices are marginalized, philosophy itself becomes impoverished. Recovering these thinkers is not about correcting a list of names. It is about recognizing how philosophy has always depended on those it later forgot. Women philosophers were not exceptions to the rule of ancient thought. They were part of its structure, even when that structure refused to acknowledge them. In the next stage of this story, the question becomes sharper. What happens to women philosophers when ancient philosophy itself is transformed, absorbed, and reinterpreted by medieval traditions? Which voices are carried forward and which are deliberately left behind? If there is one place where ancient philosophy, science, and cultural exchange reached their most intense fusion, it is Alexandria. This city was not simply a location on a map. It was an intellectual experiment. Founded at the crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, Near Eastern, and later Roman worlds, Alexandria produced a form of knowledge that refused narrow boundaries. Philosophy here was inseparable from mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and textual scholarship. For women philosophers, this environment offered both rare opportunity and extreme risk. Alexandria redefined what it meant to be a philosopher. Thought was no longer limited to abstract debate about ethics or metaphysics. It involved calculating planetary motion, editing ancient manuscripts, interpreting sacred and philosophical texts, and teaching complex systems to new generations of students. Knowledge was cumulative, technical, and collaborative. This model allowed women to enter philosophy through disciplines that were less rigidly policed by traditional civic roles. Education in Alexandria was rigorous. Philosophers were expected to master geometry, arithmetic, harmonics, and astronomy before engaging fully with metaphysics. These sciences were not treated as separate from philosophy. They were its foundation. To understand the structure of the universe was to approach truth itself. Women who excelled in these fields demonstrated philosophical authority through precision, clarity, and method rather than public rhetoric alone. Alexandrian women philosophers were often teachers first. Teaching was not considered secondary work. It was the mechanism through which philosophy survived. Lectures, commentaries, and guided readings were central to intellectual life. Women taught in private homes, informal academies, and sometimes public settings. Depending on patronage and political climate, their authority rested on competence rather than status. This intellectual culture valued interpretation. Ancient texts were not treated as static monuments but as living materials requiring explanation and correction. Commentaries became acts of philosophy in their own right. To clarify a difficult passage was to engage directly with truth. Women who wrote or dictated commentaries shaped how philosophy would be understood long after their own voices were lost. Alexandria also disrupted assumptions about the relationship between gender and intellect. In a city where scholarship mattered more than lineage, intellectual reputation could temporarily outweigh social prejudice. Women who demonstrated mastery of mathematics or astronomy occupied spaces that few could challenge without exposing their own ignorance. Knowledge functioned as protection, though never complete safety. Yet this protection was fragile. Intellectual visibility brought scrutiny. Women philosophers in Alexandria existed within a volatile mixture of political power, religious transformation, and social anxiety. As religious identities hardened, older philosophical traditions were increasingly framed as threats. Women, already marked as transgressive by their public intellectual roles, became especially vulnerable. The conflict was not only theological, it was about authority. Philosophy in Alexandria claimed the right to interpret the universe without appealing to revelation alone. This claim was dangerous in periods of religious consolidation. Women philosophers, by teaching and interpreting publicly, embodied that danger in visible form. Despite this, Alexandrian women continued to work. They taught mathematics not as neutral calculation, but as a way of disciplining the mind. They taught astronomy as a lesson in order and necessity. They taught philosophy as a practice of intellectual humility before complexity. Their classrooms were spaces where rigor replaced dogma. What distinguishes Alexandria in the history of women philosophers is the integration of knowledge. These women did not need to argue abstractly for their right to think. They demonstrated it through mastery. Their philosophy was exacting, cumulative, and demanding. It left little room for dismissal. At the same time, this model of philosophy contributed to later erasure. Technical knowledge is easier to absorb without naming its source. When later traditions inherited Alexandrian learning, they often preserved the results while forgetting the teachers. Women philosophers survived through systems they helped build, even as their names faded. Alexandria thus represents both a peak and a turning point. It shows what women philosophers could achieve when Intellectual life was organized around competence rather than exclusion. It also reveals how easily such achievements could be absorbed, neutralized, and detached from their creators. By the end of antiquity, much of Alexandrian philosophy would be transmitted through new religious and cultural frameworks. The question was no longer whether women could think philosophically. They had proven that, beyond doubt. The question became whether their presence would be remembered or rewritten. In the next part, the pressure intensifies. Philosophy collides directly with political power and religious authority. For women philosophers, this collision would determine who was silenced, who survived indirectly, and who would be transformed into warning symbols rather than remembered as thinkers. By the final centuries of antiquity, philosophy no longer existed in relative isolation from power. What had once been an activity practiced in schools, gardens, and private homes now stood directly in the path of political authority and religious consolidation. Ideas were no longer merely debated, they were judged. For women philosophers, this shift marked the most dangerous phase of all. As empires sought stability, they demanded ideological unity. Philosophical plurality, once tolerated or even celebrated, became suspect. Systems of thought that claimed independent access to truth were increasingly seen as rivals to political legitimacy and religious doctrine. Philosophy, especially when practiced publicly, was no longer neutral. Women philosophers were especially exposed in this climate. Their presence already challenged social expectations. When combined with intellectual authority, teaching roles, or public influence, that challenge became intolerable to institutions built on hierarchy and control. What had once been unconventional now appeared threatening. The conflict was not abstract. It entered the body. Clothing, speech, movement, and teaching practices became politicized. A woman who spoke too confidently, taught too publicly, or attracted too many students could be accused of moral corruption, heresy, or social disorder. Philosophy was reframed not as inquiry, but as defiance. Religious transformation intensified these pressures. As dominant belief systems solidified, older philosophical traditions were reinterpreted through hostile lenses. Practices once associated with wisdom were recast as dangerous, remnants of a discredited past. Women philosophers, already marginal, became convenient symbols in narratives of purification and reform. The accusation was rarely philosophical. It was personal. Women thinkers were attacked not for flawed arguments, but for their existence. Their intellect was questioned through their bodies. Their authority was undermined through rumors of impropriety, emotional instability, or moral excess. This strategy allowed opponents to dismiss ideas without engaging them. Teaching, once a respected philosophical activity, became a liability. To gather students was to attract attention. To explain complex ideas was to risk misinterpretation. To persist was to invite punishment. Many women philosophers adapted by retreating into private instruction or limiting their audiences. Philosophy survived, but under constraint. Others refused to retreat. For them, philosophy was inseparable from courage. They continued to teach, write, and speak, knowing the cost. Their persistence reveals a crucial truth. Philosophy has never been safe. It has always carried risk, especially for those without institutional protection. Violence, when it came, was not spontaneous. It was enabled by rhetoric that portrayed women philosophers as corrupting forces. Intellectual disagreement was reframed as moral danger. Crowds were mobilized not against ideas, but against bodies associated with those ideas. The silencing of women philosophers was often public, symbolic, and irreversible. Even when physical violence did not occur, erasure followed. Texts were lost, destroyed, or no longer copied. Lineages were broken. Students learned doctrines without knowing their sources. Women philosophers were reduced to footnotes, anecdotes, or cautionary tales, stripped of intellectual context. This process reshaped the philosophical canon. What survived did so not only because of quality, But because of compatibility with new power structures, philosophy that could be harmonized with dominant ideologies was preserved. Philosophy that resisted was forgotten. Women philosophers associated with resistance by virtue of their visibility were disproportionately excluded. Yet exclusion is not absence. The ideas did not vanish. They were absorbed, reframed, and transmitted under different names. Ethical concepts, metaphysical structures, and pedagogical methods developed by women philosophers continued to circulate, even as their authorship disappeared. Influence survived without recognition. This stage of antiquity reveals philosophy at its most vulnerable, not because ideas weakened, but because power tightened its grip on meaning. Women philosophers were among the first to be sacrificed in this struggle, precisely because they embodied philosophy as lived independence. Understanding this period requires abandoning the myth that intellectual progress naturally leads to greater inclusion. Knowledge can expand while voices shrink. Sophistication can coexist with silence. The fate of women philosophers in this era is not an anomaly. It is a warning. In the next part, the story turns inward, with texts lost and names erased. How did women philosophers survive within philosophical tradition at all? The answer lies in indirect transmission, hidden labor, and intellectual continuity without credit. When women philosophers disappeared from public memory, they did not disappear from philosophy itself. What vanished were their names, their authorship, and their visibility. What remained were their ideas, methods, and intellectual labor, carried forward quietly through indirect transmission. As antiquity gave way to new cultural and religious frameworks, philosophy did not reset, it was filtered. Texts were selected, copied, summarized, and adapted. This process was never neutral. Choices were made about what deserved preservation and what did not. In this filtering, women philosophers were rarely preserved as authorities. Instead, they survived as influences without attribution. One of the most common mechanisms of erasure was absorption. Ideas developed or refined by women were incorporated into larger philosophical systems without acknowledgement. Commentaries were rewritten, teachings were summarized under the names of male students or successors. Over time, the origin of these ideas became indistinguishable from the tradition itself. Teaching played a crucial role in this process. Many women philosophers did not write for posterity. They taught directly. Their classrooms were living archives. When their students went on to write, teach, or institutionalize philosophy, they carried that training with them. The intellectual imprint remained even when the teacher's name did not. This form of survival is difficult to trace. It leaves no clear signature. Historians encounter it as style, emphasis, or method rather than explicit citation. A particular approach to ethical discipline, a way of explaining metaphysical hierarchy, a pedagogical structure that prioritizes clarity over display. These traces suggest continuity without credit. Another mechanism was moralization. Women philosophers were often remembered not as thinkers, but as exemplars of virtue, asceticism, or cautionary excess. Their intellectual work was reframed as character traits. Wisdom became modesty, authority became restraint. This transformation allowed traditions to keep the figure while discarding the philosophy. In some cases, women philosophers were preserved only through hostile or distorted narratives. Accusations, rumors, and polemics survived where teachings did not. Paradoxically, these hostile sources confirm influence. One does not argue so fiercely against irrelevance. Even distorted memory is evidence of impact. Religious institutions played an ambiguous role. On one hand, they suppressed philosophical plurality and marginalized women's intellectual authority. On the other, they preserved educational practices that philosophy depended on: commentary, memorization, disciplined study. Within these structures, women continued to teach, often under different titles and within constrained roles. Monastic and devotional contexts absorbed philosophical techniques such as self-examination, ethical discipline, and metaphysical reflection. These techniques did not originate in isolation. They were part of ancient philosophical practice shaped in part by women philosophers. The methods survived even as their origins were forgotten. This raises a difficult question. Is survival without recognition a form of survival at all? From one perspective, philosophy endured. Ideas lived on. From another, injustice persisted. Intellectual labor was taken without acknowledgement. Women philosophers were made foundational yet invisible. The canon, as it formed in later periods, reinforced this invisibility. Authority became linked to named authorship. Anonymous influence did not count. Philosophy was increasingly narrated as a sequence of great men and preserved texts. Women, whose contributions often existed outside these formats, were structurally excluded, yet exclusion does not equal insignificance. The very stability of philosophical traditions depended on continuity, teaching, and interpretation. These functions were disproportionately carried by figures who did not receive lasting recognition. Women philosophers belong to this hidden infrastructure. Understanding Part 6 means accepting an uncomfortable truth. Philosophy has always relied on unseen labor. The history we inherit privileges, visibility over contribution. When we look only for names, we miss structures. When we look only for texts, we miss transmission. Women philosophers survived antiquity not as monuments, but as foundations. Varied, load-bearing, essential. Their ideas shaped how philosophy was taught, practiced, and understood long after their identities were erased. In the next and final movement of this history, attention shifts to the present. How were these women rediscovered? What does it mean to recover voices that survived only indirectly? And how does this recovery change philosophy itself? For centuries, women philosophers of antiquity existed in a condition of partial disappearance. They were not entirely erased, yet they were never fully present. Their names surfaced occasionally in marginal notes, brief references or dismissive anecdotes, but rarely as central figures in philosophical history. What survived was fragmented, unstable, and often filtered through voices that did not intend to preserve them as thinkers. The modern study of philosophy inherited a canon shaped by transmission, selection, and institutional authority. Philosophy became defined by preserved texts, named authors, and formal systems that could be taught within universities. This framework rewarded continuity of authorship and punished forms of knowledge that were oral, communal, or indirect. Women philosophers, whose contributions often existed outside these favored formats, were left at the edges. Early historians of philosophy frequently treated ancient women, thinkers, as legends or curiosities rather than intellectual agents. When evidence was scarce, doubt replaced investigation. Absence was taken as proof of irrelevance. Silence was mistaken for emptiness. The possibility that voices had been deliberately muted was rarely considered. Change began slowly. Scholars started to question how philosophical history had been constructed, rather than simply accepting its results. They examined who had the power to preserve texts and whose work was considered worthy of copying. They began to treat gaps not as failures of evidence, but as historical facts that demanded explanation. Fragments once dismissed as insignificant were reread. Passing mentions in hostile sources were analyzed carefully. Polemics, rumors, and moral accusations were no longer read at face value, but as indicators of intellectual presence that provoked reaction. A woman mentioned only to be criticized suddenly appeared not as marginal, but as influential enough to require silencing. This reevaluation required a shift in method. Instead of searching only for complete systems and authoritative treatises, scholars began to look for patterns of participation, teaching practices, commentary traditions, and intellectual networks became visible as philosophical activity. The history of philosophy expanded beyond texts to include transmission, mentorship, and lived practice. Feminist scholarship played a decisive role in this transformation. It challenged the assumption that philosophy advances through isolated geniuses, detached from social context. It questioned why rationality had been associated with distance, abstraction, and traits coded as masculine. It insisted that philosophy is not only what is written, but what is taught, embodied, and sustained. As these perspectives took hold, women philosophers were no longer treated as anomalies. They were recognized as participants in shared traditions, contributors to collective knowledge, and carriers of intellectual continuity. Their marginalization was understood not as a reflection of their ability, but as the result of historical power dynamics. This process of recovery remains incomplete. Many voices cannot be fully restored. Texts have vanished beyond reconstruction. Some figures survive only as shadows. Acknowledging these limits is not a weakness. It is an ethical stance. It resists the temptation to replace one false certainty with another. What emerges from this work is not a corrected list of names, but a transformed understanding of philosophy itself. Philosophy appears not as a neutral accumulation of ideas, but as a human practice shaped by inclusion and exclusion. Its history contains both brilliance and silence, insight and injustice. To recognize ancient women philosophers is to accept that philosophy has always depended on unseen labor. It is to understand that intellectual traditions are sustained not only by those remembered, but by those forgotten. When these figures are brought back into view, philosophy does not lose clarity. It gains depth. This recognition does not close the story, it opens it. Philosophy becomes less about preserving a fixed canon and more about questioning how knowledge is formed, transmitted, and valued. In this expanded view, ancient women philosophers are no longer peripheral. They are essential to understanding what philosophy has been and what it can still become. To speak of ancient women philosophers is not to add missing names to an already complete story. It is to confront the foundations of philosophy itself. What appears, at first glance, as an act of recovery slowly reveals itself as an act of transformation. When these women are brought back into view, philosophy changes shape. Its boundaries shift. Its assumptions are exposed. For centuries, philosophy presented itself as a lineage of preserved texts and celebrated authors. Authority was equated with survival. What endured was assumed to be what mattered most. Yet endurance was never neutral. Texts survived because they were copied. Names survived because they were endorsed. Entire ways of thinking vanished not because they lacked depth, but because they lacked protection. Ancient women philosophers stand at the fault line of this process. Their disappearance forces a question that philosophy has often avoided. Who decides what counts as knowledge? Their absence is not a gap in information. It is evidence of selection, power, and fear. To recognize this is to admit that philosophy has a history of exclusion woven into its core. These women did not fail to enter philosophy. Philosophy failed to contain them. They thought in forms that resisted easy preservation. They taught rather than proclaimed. They practiced rather than displayed. Their authority emerged through clarity, discipline, and continuity, not through monuments or treatises designed for immortality. When philosophy is understood only as a written archive, these figures remain invisible. But when philosophy is understood as a living practice, they appear everywhere, in methods of teaching that privilege explanation over display, in ethical systems that emphasize self-discipline rather than domination, in metaphysical structures that value order, relation, and coherence over conquest. The recovery of ancient women philosophers also destabilizes familiar hierarchies. It reveals that intellectual brilliance was never the monopoly of a single gender or class. It exposes how often exclusion masqueraded as tradition. What was presented as natural Order turns out to be historical habit, reinforced by repetition. This recognition does not weaken philosophy, it deepens it. Philosophy becomes less about defending a canon and more about understanding how canons are formed. It shifts from veneration to inquiry, from inheritance to responsibility. There is discomfort in this shift. It requires abandoning the comfort of certainty. It demands that gaps be taken seriously rather than ignored. It insists that silence be read as meaning, not as absence. This discomfort is not a threat to philosophy, it is its renewal. Ancient women philosophers remind us that philosophy has always depended on courage. Not only the courage to think differently, but the courage to think without guarantees of recognition. They practice philosophy in environments that question their right to exist as thinkers at all. That they persisted is not incidental. It is central to what philosophy is. Their lives also challenge modern assumptions about progress. Inclusion does not automatically increase with time. Knowledge can expand while memory contracts. Sophistication can coexist with erasure. The past is not a simple ladder leading upward. It is a field of struggles, losses, and survivals. To bring these women into focus is not to romanticize them. It is to see them clearly, as thinkers shaped by their circumstances and constrained by them. Their philosophy was not pure abstraction. It was strategic, embodied, and often precarious. It responded to real risks, real limitations, and real consequences. This understanding transforms how philosophy is taught. Instead of presenting it as a sequence of isolated geniuses, it can be approached as a network of practices sustained by many kinds of labor. Teaching, explanation, mentorship, and care become visible as philosophical acts. Authority becomes something earned through responsibility rather than inherited through name. It also transforms how philosophy is practiced today. If philosophy is not merely the preservation of a canon, then it is open to revision. If authority is not fixed, then new voices matter. If exclusion has shaped the past, then awareness can shape the future. Ancient women philosophers do not ask to be admired. They ask to be taken seriously. Their return is not a correction at the margins. It is a demand at the center. To recognize them is to accept that philosophy is unfinished, unstable, and alive. In this light, philosophy becomes less a monument and more a conversation, one that stretches across centuries, carried by voices that were often forced into silence but never fully erased. To listen now is not an act of charity. It is an act of fidelity to philosophy itself, because philosophy at its deepest level is not about who was remembered. It is about who thought, who taught, who endured, and who refused to disappear.